Hi everybody, this is a brief supplemental video to Chapter 4 on infancy. It will be relatively brief, so it's just some additional information that wasn't necessarily covered in detail in the textbook. So we talked about this a bit in the textbook, but I wanted to get a bit more specific in terms of brain development. And we already discussed that experience is really important in terms of brain environment or brain development. So the environment plays a big role in the development of the brain. And there's basically two types of classes of brain development. One's called experience expectant. And so there's aspects in our brain that basically anticipate experiences that are universal in all members of the species. And so these would include things like depth perception. So we would expect to have experiences that would help us develop depth perception. And so we have areas in our brains that are geared towards that, and we have synapses, connections between neurons that will help develop brain matter related to depth perception. And so that's an example of an experience that's seen as universal. There's probably hundreds of thousands of things that we could include in that, but I think that's a relatively straightforward one. And so these are things that are, if you will, hardwired and ready for action. But still, we need some environmental stimulus to set those connections together. So while they're there and ready to go, you need those experiences. And if you don't have certain experiences, you won't develop those connections, and you won't have depth perception. And so here with experience expectant development, we have what we call exuberant synaptogenesis. So it just means that there's a lot. So especially with those universal experience expectant aspects, there's a lot of potential connections between neurons in our brains that will develop. And those will develop very easily and very quickly when we have those experiences that help make those connections. When we don't have those experiences, then we're going to have the synaptic pruning. And so if you don't have those experiences, you won't make those connections, and you won't develop that stuff. So in this case, the depth perception won't develop. There's also called experience-dependent brain development. And this is just basically, this is in response to experience. And so there's various things in our brains that we can learn things. And having experience, especially various experience, will help make more of these interconnections. These are just natural, if you will. I shouldn't say natural, but these are just generalized. So experience expectant are a bit more specific in terms of functions related to all members of our species. Experience dependent is essentially that our brain can learn many different things, and then based on our experience, we can learn those things, make those connections, or we don't make those connections, we don't learn those things. So experience dependent is a little bit more generalized. Experience expectant is a little bit more what we call functional in relationship to the survival of our species. And then in terms of this, and we kind of hinted at this a little bit in class, is essentially in terms of brain development, if there's a lack of experience or if there's deprivation, so deprivation is lack of stimulus, whether that stimulus is visual, sensory, or emotional, or cognitive, these things can lead to early life adversity. So if you lack these experiences or you have deprivation, there's going to be quite a bit of synaptic pruning. You're not going to make those connections between your neurons. There's not going to be an advantage related to the synaptogenesis that we talked about earlier. So there'll be early life adversity, but as we'll talk about throughout the class, is that we have, in development, we have both continuity and discontinuity. Continuity means that we see the same things over life. So for some people who have early life adversity, this sets a pathway that they stay on. They stay on that pathway of development. So they might not develop cognitively, they might not develop emotionally. This could affect their relationships, this affects how they go through school, this affects their future occupations, this affects their marriages, this affects how they raise their children. So there's this continuity throughout life. We can also have discontinuity. So, for example, in this case, if you set off early in life with adversity, you can get off that path. So there can be discontinuity. That could be maybe you go to school and in primary school or elementary school you have a teacher who takes an interest in you and helps you develop, makes a connection with you emotionally, helps you develop cognitively, and that changes your life, that changes your pathway. Or maybe there's a neighbor who takes you under their wing and protects you and shows an interest in you, and that helps you develop socially and emotionally. There's various mechanisms, you know, it could be a friend, maybe you make a friend in middle school or junior high school, and that friend and their family changes your life, and that leads to some discontinuity. So there's many different points of discontinuity. So just because you start off with this early life adversity, it doesn't mean that you need to stay in that pathway. In terms of the brain, giving these experiences of discontinuity, so I talked about, you know, several examples of discontinuity. So when you have these experiences, so remember the environment plays a role in shaping the brain. So if you have these experiences that push towards discontinuity and change, in the brain we can say that there's plasticity. Plasticity means that our brain can change and modify over time. It is true that, you know, things get set on a pathway early on, but that doesn't mean that your brain can't change and can't develop later. On the other side of that is this idea of sensitive periods. So there are sensitive periods where certain aspects of development are easier to develop, to produce during that time. And this can relate to our brains also. So for example, when kids are school age, you know, primary school, elementary school, we could say that they're pretty sensitive to learning things. Kids love to learn, their brains are geared to help them learn. And so in terms of cognitive development, that's a very sensitive period of time. So any experience, let's say you have a adverse early life and your cognitive development is not so great early on because you haven't had a stimulating environment. If you go into the school environment and something in the school environment, whether it's friends, the teacher, maybe it's just the school itself, is stimulating, the environment is stimulating in terms of cognitive development, your cognitive development can improve. And there will be times that will be sensitive periods where you can see that discontinuity, you can see that change more likely than other times of life. Change is always possible, but when you hit somebody in a sensitive period and you introduce them to a new environment, that change will happen faster and more completely. So that's just some basics of the brain. And we touched on this idea of continuity and discontinuity. And so we will explore issues of continuity and discontinuity throughout the semester. But I did want to introduce that in relationship to the brain. So your book did talk about temperament. And remember we talked in the book about Thomas and Chess's. You can say Chess or Thomas, doesn't really matter. Thomas and Chess's basic three types. So we talked about the temperament being this idea that kids are born essentially with some basic stuff of their personality, and I already mentioned in the book video that the research is not so strong on that contention that it's innate and natural. So I won't repeat that here in detail. But Thomas and Chess's types are easy. So an easy child has basically positive moods. They easily adapt to new environments. They're not overly reactive. They're not sensitive to stimulus. They pay attention to new things in the environment, but they're not reactive. They're not overly sensitive to it. Difficult kids tend to be resistant to change. They have very irregular patterns of behavior. So we talked already in class, for example, that infants don't have a regularity yet to their patterns of their behavior, like sleeping and things like that. That develops with time and with their neurological development. But for difficult kids, they don't show that development. They still show irregularity, and they're often quite negative in terms of their affect or emotions. And then slow to warm kids, we talked about them kind of being a little bit more anxious and not having a lot of activity level when they're in a new environment. But when they're in that new environment for a while, they can adapt and they can start acting more positively. That's just a quick review of the Thomas and Chess stuff. I did want to show you an elaboration of the theory of temperament. Rothbart is the main theorist, although Rothbart has had a number of co-authors. So Rothbart has broken it down to 3 other things that are kind of related to Thomas and Chess, but tries to make it more streamlined. So one is surgency. So that's basically mood and activity and stimulation seeking. So, you know, how happy the child is, how active is the kid. Do they explore the environment? So stimulation seeking. Negative affects, so negative emotions. That would include being angry, fearful, frustrated, shy, and it's hard to soothe them. And then this last thing is called effortful control. So essentially, can the kid focus their attention and inhibit their impulses or their responses? And so for Rothbart, Rothbart has broken down temperament into these 3 dimensions. And I'd say that the last dimension is seen as especially important. So being able to regulate one's behavior and one's emotions and one's impulses is seen as really central in the development of infants, toddlers, and early childhood. So I wanted to present you with a little bit more elaborate model there. That's Rothbart's model of temperament. In the chapter video, we did review Piaget's approach to cognitive development. I had in some of my previous notes a nice illustration of the substage 5, which is the tertiary circular reactions. And so here, what I like is the explanation on the right. So remember, in the earlier substages, kids are either doing things accidentally and they repeat it because it's something that's pleasurable. That's primary circular reactions. And then there's secondary circular reactions, which is basically they're a little bit more planful in doing something, but essentially they're doing it because they like it, it's pleasurable. And they're secondary because they're usually a little bit more coordinated in the muscle movements, the motor movements. So remember, sensory motor development, that's what Piaget is talking about. So the motor movements are a bit more complex in secondary versus primary circular reactions. And there's a little bit more intentionality. The primary are accidental, but they might get repeated once they do the accident. Secondary is a little bit more intentional. Tertiary circular reactions go beyond that. So tertiary circular reactions, I talked about this a bit in the chapter video, but I think this illustrates it well. It's more about this sort of scientific thinking about cause and effect. This slide might go a little bit too far in terms of saying explained or understood, but the idea is that the baby's kind of doing mini experiments to see the consequences. So there's a rudimentary, a very basic way of cause and effect thinking here. So I did want to include this if it helps you understand those tertiary circular reactions versus the primary and secondary. And let's talk about infants' emotions a little bit. And so I wanted to talk about some basic perspectives. I don't know if I want to call it theories, but basic perspectives on emotional development. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this is that it illustrates something that we should talk about and know from class, which is EDIC, or EDIC, sometimes it's pronounced, EDIC versus EMIC approaches. So in terms of EDIC approaches, you can say EDIC, I'm not sure which is which, but these EDIC approaches talk about universal aspects of human behavior and development. So if we're talking about emotions, we're going to talk about universal aspects of emotion. And we'll get to some specific examples in the following slides. And an EMIC is about cultural context. So EDIC or EDIC is universal. EMIC is about cultural influences on behavior and development. In this case, emotions. So remember, EDIC is about basic emotions, so these universal things. And so when we look at infants, there's a discussion about basic emotions which are universal across cultures. And what I'll say is that there's some debate about how many there are. I think most of the debate is some range between 4 to 8 basic emotions. And by basic emotions, if you look at infants across different cultures, they have these emotional expressions. So some of the core emotions are joy, anger, surprise, sadness, disgust. So when you look at babies in different cultures, they show the same facial expressions to show these same emotions. So they seem to be universal. And the idea is that these are based in evolution, and that these have been functional to help us survive. And so the idea is that we're sort of born with these things. In fact, Darwin wrote a book about emotional expressions in Man and Animals, I think is the title of the book. And so, Darwin argued that there are universal expressions across human beings, but also argued that some of those same expressions you can see in animals, especially primates. So there's a very strong evolutionary tie to these basic emotions. So much so that we seem to be hardwired to express these things and to understand these things. And when I say understand these things, understand them when we see them in other people. So you can imagine, in terms of survival, it's good to know if somebody else is angry or somebody else is showing disgust. If somebody eats something that we're eating, they show disgust, you're going to stop eating it right away. It's a survival mechanism. The EMIC approach, so this is culturally specific things, are what's called secondary emotions. I think I'm going to edit this right now. Somehow it didn't get there. So these are secondary emotions, and they're blends of primary emotions. So the primary emotions that we talked about seem to be the building blocks of secondary emotions. And in general, infants will show primary emotions well before they show secondary emotions. So the primary emotions seem to be hardwired. They show up early. Secondary emotions are developed over time in response to sort of culture and social interactions within the culture. And so there's many examples of possible secondary emotions, but remorse, guilt, submission, anticipation, many other ones are secondary emotions. And these are more culturally bound, and they, again, develop later in infancy and toddlerhood than primary emotions. So the primaries are the building blocks, secondaries are using those building blocks for cultural needs, culturally specific interactions. And it's really interesting. I've done this in like my general psych course before. Is what I do is I do a little activity, and I have a list of some of the basic emotions on cards, on separate cards, and then I have a list of some secondary emotions on cards. So one emotion per card. And what I do is I usually will shuffle them so that the primary and secondary are shuffled in their order. And what I do is I have people get in pairs, and one person is the sender of the emotion, and the other person is the reader of the emotion. So the senders, they get the cards, and then for every card they're supposed to show the emotion. And then the reader, the other person, is supposed to guess what emotion the person is displaying. And one of the interesting things about this activity is that the hit rate for basic emotions is very high. Like, I wouldn't say 100% because we always get something that's a little bit off, but I would say it's over 90%. It's over 90% in terms of the reader getting the basic emotion right. The secondary emotions, it's horrible. You know, the best I see is maybe 60%, but sometimes I see around 30 to 40%. The point here is that the basic emotions are kind of more pure. They're universal. They're easy for the sender to display. They're easy for the reader to understand. Secondary emotions are much more difficult. They're more difficult to express facially. They're also more difficult to read from facial expressions. So even though they're culturally bound, there's a lot of errors that people can make with secondary emotions because they're not as deeply rooted in us as the primary ones are. Getting into emotions a little bit more with infants, there's something we call primary intersubjectivity. So that's a big, long word. Basically, it's talking about this. It says organized reciprocal face-to-face interactions with the infant and caregiver. And the interaction is the focus. So basically what happens is, with infants, if you've ever done this, and kind of played with infants, there's kind of like a little conversation. You know, you don't have words, but you have conversations. So you might look at the infant, you might smile at the infant might smile back, and then you do something, the infant does something, you do something, the infant does something. It's like a little conversation. That's intersubjectivity. There's that connection. And when you look at these interactions, they usually have a pattern. There's usually some sort of flow. There's a sequence. There's a rhythm to the interaction. So that's part of that organized. So the word organized, you know, think about it like there's a rhythm to it. And for infants, this is one of the roots of social development. And also emotional development, understanding their emotions better. And then what they've done is they've done things in laboratories where they manipulate intersubjectivity. So this sounds a bit cruel, but sometimes they have still face. So they tell the adult not to make any faces, to have a still face. What happens is that the infants initially want to sort of interact with you, but once they see your still face, they kind of stop doing it, and then they disengage. So there's not intersubjectivity there. So just being around the infants, not intersubjectivity. There has to be some sort of interaction. And it's a pretty emotional interaction with facial expressions. They also do this thing called delayed transmission. So the adult is told not to react immediately to the infant, but to delay their reaction, let's say by 5 seconds, 10 seconds. This also totally throws off the interaction. So there's a very fine dance here, if you will. There's a very fine pattern of interactions between the infant and the adult. And very simple things can disrupt it, and that can affect the baby's social development and emotional development. And so, they have focused a lot on mothers here, so maternal depression, but what I'll say, it doesn't matter. So if you have a primary caregiver, regardless of their gender or gender identity, it doesn't matter. So whoever the primary caregiver is, if that primary caregiver is depressed, that can be an obstacle to intersubjectivity. So if you have a depressed caregiver, they might show some of the stuff. They might show more of the neutral or still face, so sort of neutral facial expressions. And there may also be a delayed transmission. So somebody who's depressed, they might not react as fast to the infant. And so depression of a primary caregiver can make the intersubjectivity more disorganized and could be pretty unresponsive to the kid's emotions. And what happens is that the infants basically over time disengage from that interaction. Although it's still not as bad as having just a total still face reaction, but still infants over time disengage in this environment. And so intersubjectivity, sort of being there, being present for the infant, being able to have this conversation, this emotional conversation with the infant, is something that's really important for not only their emotional, social development, but also their learning cognitive stuff. So they're learning about sequences, they're learning about predictions of behavior, they're learning about cause and effect. So when we talk about these systems, they're not disconnected. So emotional stuff affects social development, that all affects cognitive development. So these things are all interconnected. And I'd say also it affects the physical development. So remember, we have synaptogenesis, and actually we have exuberant synaptogenesis. So things that are anticipated to be universal in a species. I would say that intersubjectivity, primary intersubjectivity, to me, is one of those universals of human beings. We're hardwired to do this. Infants are hardwired to take place in this conversation with us. So with primary intersubjectivity, we have exuberant synaptogenesis, so that baby's ready to learn things. That baby's ready to learn about emotions, their emotions, about patterns in relationships, patterns in conversations, about cause and effect. They're hardwired to do that. Good primary intersubjectivity interactions will help develop those connections. If there's a lack of experience, then we can have synaptic pruning involved in these things. So babies, again, are hardwired, ready to learn these things. And so it's important to give them an environment that promotes this development. I just quickly wanted to show you a picture of one of Harlow's monkeys. So we did talk in class a bit about Harlow's monkeys real quickly, and I did mention the monkey that stayed on the cloth mother and would stay on the cloth mother but kind of lean over for the milk from the wire mother. So that's just a illustration, a picture of a monkey doing that. There's a term I want you to know too. It's called social referencing. We made quick mention of this in class, but we didn't give it a term. So social referencing, so infants, toddlers, when they're in an unfamiliar situation or an unfamiliar event happens, they'll look to their caregiver in terms of how to feel and act in that situation. So a very simple example of this is if you have an infant or a toddler and you're with them and then a stranger comes into the room. They don't know that person. Most infants, most toddlers will look at their caregiver to see if they should be afraid. So see how they feel. To see if they should be afraid and run to them, or whether everything's okay, they don't have to be afraid. They look to you to see how they should feel and act in that unfamiliar situation. That's called social referencing. And that's it for the supplemental video. So not too bad in terms of time, just about a half an hour. So these are things that weren't covered necessarily fully in the textbook, and are things that you should know about infant development. So I will see you in class, and take care.